1 September, 1971. The Sorting. Lavinia Selwyn stood with her family on the platform, back straight, eyes forward, and face blank, just as she had been taught. Behind her, her mother and father had the same stone-cold expressions on their face. Her younger brother, William, let his eyes wander somewhat, but even he walked with a pride befitting his blood status. "Well," said Lavinia's father, "time to get on the train." Lavinia nodded and turned to look back at her parents. Neither seemed terribly upset that she would be gone for the next 4 months, but then, she hadn't expected them to be. "We are Selwyns, after all," said a voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like her mother. "And remember, Lavinia," her mother said now, looking down at her eldest child, "another Black is going to be in your year. They're a useful family to know. Narcissa has already agreed to keep an eye out for you." Her mother paused and almost smiled, a tight-lipped little thing that looked almost painful for her. "Make useful friends, Lavinia. Make us proud." It sounded like a threat, but Lavinia wasn't fazed. She'd been mentally adding the "or else" to the end of her mother's sentences for years. So she simply inclined her head to her mother, then to her father, and finally put her hand on her little brother's shoulder and faced him directly. William looked up at her, his lower lip pushed out slightly in a pout. "You keep up with your lessons while I'm gone, okay? I'll write you." William nodded, and, just as Lavinia was pulling away, he wrapped his arms briefly around her. She patted his shoulder, and the family parted ways. Aboard the train, Lavinia made her way slowly down the length of one car after another, looking for familiar faces. She was a little over halfway down the train when she came across a compartment with 2 girls and a boy, all 3 of whom she recognized. Opening the compartment door, she nodded at them slightly. "Not Folly," she said, addressing the 2 girls. "Avery," she added, inclining her head to the boy who sat opposite them in the compartment. Eloise Knott, a slight girl with shoulder-length brown hair, gave a soft smile. "Selwyn," she said simply. "Nice to see you again." "May I join you?" Lavinia asked the compartment in general. "Of course," Knott replied, and Lavinia made a mental note of her eagerness. The Knotts were a smaller family, and of course their daughter would be tasked with making connections to the bigger names in the pureblood circles. Lavinia sat down next to Thomas Avery, who was on the tall side, with jet-black hair and a perpetual frown. Across from her was Knott, and next to Knott was Alexandra Folly. Alexandra was something of a friend of Lavinia's, or at least as close of a friend as her parents would ever let her have. Their family estates were reasonably close together, and they'd grown up as some of the only children at their parents' respective dinner parties. Alexandra flashed Lavinia a smile and went back to staring out the window. The rest of the train ride passed mostly in silence, with the exception of a slight disturbance a few compartments down. Knott stuck her head out of the compartment door to see what the fuss was about, and frowned down the hall for a moment before closing the door and sitting back down. "It's Black and some random kid," she said simply. Avery rolled his eyes. "Why isn't Black sitting with us?" asked Alexandra. "Our families know each other well enough." "True, but then again, how much has Sirius conformed to his family's wishes?" asked Avery. Lavinia frowned. Her parents wouldn't be pleased if her best shot at a connection to the Black family was going out the window because Sirius couldn't be bothered to take his family name seriously. Still, Sirius had never openly defied his parents in the time Lavinia had known him, and she didn't suppose he was about to start. She was rather wrong about that, of course, but at the time it seemed like a logical conclusion given the rage she had seen from Walburga Black the few times she'd seen Sirius put a toe out of line. When they arrived at the castle, they were ferried across the lake by a strange and somewhat alarmingly large man, and set to wait in a chamber off what Lavinia presumed must be the great hall. She stood in the same group she'd sat with on the train and in the boat, and the 4 of them were silent. Around them, students whispered nervously, speculating about the sorting and worrying about their house placements. Lavinia suppressed an eye roll and continued staring at the portraits. She knew which house she'd be in. She only had one option. Her mother would flay her alive if she wasn't a Slytherin. Wouldn't that be fun? Eventually, they were all led into the hall, and the sorting began. Avery, who was up almost immediately, barely had the hat brush his head before he was sorted into Slytherin, to no one's surprise, and general polite applause from the Slytherin table. Within the first few minutes, Lavinia had mostly tuned out. She didn't see what was so interesting about the sorting. She and all the people she'd grown up with would all be put in the same place anyway, just like their parents. "Black, Sirius," called Professor McGonagall from the front. Sirius Black walked up the steps, sat on the stool facing the hall, and McGonagall placed the hat on his head. Lavinia, who had been expecting an immediate decision as soon as she'd heard the name Black announced, looked up when the hat paused. It seemed to hesitate for a moment, and then, "Gryffindor!" cried the hat. Lavinia felt her jaw fall open. Next to her, Eloise and Alexandra bore similar expressions of shock, and Lavinia heard Alexandra murmur, "Bloody hell." Lavinia understood what drove Alexandra, who had always been prim and proper, to swear. It wasn't just that a black, had been sorted into Gryffindor. It was that from what Lavinia had seen of Walburga Black, Sirius was a dead man walking. And of course, Lavinia's own parents would be furious at the loss of potential connection to such a powerful pureblood family. But Sirius? He was just a kid, and his mother would never forgive him for tarnishing the family name like this. Lavinia felt a pang of pity for the boy, though her mother would have chastised her for it. What did it matter to her? He was just a connection, to be used to her advantage. Caring made it harder to use people. Several other students' names had been called before Lavinia started paying attention again. Alexandra was sorted into Slytherin, predictable, and Eloise followed not too long after. Eventually, Potter, James, was called, and Lavinia could feel her lips purse. The Potter family, though purebloods in all technicality, had not made the Sacred 28, and did not partake in the pureblood community Lavinia's family was so ingrained in. She had often heard her parents disparage the Potters. Blood traitors, that's what they were. At long last, McGonagall called for "Selwyn, Lavinia," and the girl made her way to the stool without any trace of nerves. She knew what she wanted, and she knew what would happen, which was why she was shocked when the hat was allowed to fall all the way over her eyes before it made a decision. Lavinia felt her eyebrows raise and heard a slight chuckle in her head. "You know, my dear," said the voice, which, she reasoned, must belong to the sorting hat. "You are not nearly as easy to sort as you think. But even so—" "Slytherin!" shouted the hat, and Lavinia hopped off the stool and made her way to sit beside Alexandra, who gave her a long look. "That took a moment or two, didn't it?" Nott asked, rather pointedly. "I wanted to ask it a question," Lavinia lied smoothly. "A question?" It was Avery this time, disbelief etched in every syllable. "Yes, a question, Avery. Can't you hear?" Lavinia snapped. She could practically hear her mother's voice in her head, warning her not to let anyone question her integrity. "I wanted to know why it put Black in Gryffindor." That shut them up. "Did it answer?" asked Nott. Her tone entirely shifted. "No," Lavinia responded curtly. "Told me I was being nosy. Who knew Headwear could be so rude?" Alexandra gave a light laugh, and the four children turned their attention back to the sorting just in time to see a boy with greasy black hair striding towards them. He sat next to Nott and stuck his hand out across the table. "Snape," he said by way of introduction. "Severus Snape." Lavinia didn't take his hand. She gave him a cold stare. "Selwyn," she said, pride recognizable in her tone. "Lavinia Selwyn." Snape, who looked somewhat affronted at having his hand left hanging midair, nodded at her, and Lavinia amended, reminding herself that her fellow Slytherins would always make valuable allies. "Congratulations," she said, making eye contact with Snape. "Welcome to Slytherin." Snape returned her smile with a forced smirk, and they turned their eyes back to the front of the hall.